Hello colleagues, and welcome to Week 1, Unit 5 of SAP Cloud Platform Version Control with Git. In this unit, we will cover some of the Git basics. We will talk about how to create new versions in your local repository, called commits, discuss how Git knows which changes you actually want to be incorporated into your commits, and describe ignored files and amended commits. When you have a Git repository, and you do some typing to modify the file, obviously the state of the file doesn't change until you save it and persist the file modifications that you've made so that you have saved changes. You already know this, just as anyone who has used a computer for more than an hour knows this. But what I want to point out here is that just because you've saved changes to a file, that doesn't mean that Git knows about those changes. After you've saved your changes, you need to do something else in order for Git to be aware of them. What you need to do is to move those changed files to what's called Git's staging area by staging those files. Once you stage files, they're now being tracked by Git. All the changes you've staged are known as a snapshot. You can think of a snapshot as a potential future new version. Now, once you've made all the changes you want to make for your new version, saved all those changes, and finally moved the files to the staging area so that the current snapshot is an accurate reflection of the new version you want to create, you perform what in Git is known as a commit. By issuing the commit command, you are saying, take all my saved and staged changes and make them into a new version. The new version goes into the repository. And by the way, the Git lingo is to talk about commits, not versions, so from now on, that's the main term I'm going to use. So all the changes make up a new commit in the local repository, and note that I said local repository. Remember that in a distributed version control system like Git, each developer will have his or her own repository. So you can make 100 commits, and the only repository that will be affected by you making those commits is your own local repository. One other thing to note is this. Everything I've said in this slide so far has used a modified file or files as an example. But this could apply to creating a file as well. If you create a new file, you have to stage it in order for the new file to be part of the next commit. Also, if you delete an existing file, you have to stage the file deletion in order for that file removal to be part of the next commit operation. So, we've talked about 4 different states of files in a Git repository. They can be modified, saved, staged, and committed. It's an extremely common mistake in Git and in Web IDE to accidentally think you made a commit because you hit the commit button and you typed in a commit message, but you forgot to stage anything. Of course, it's impossible to commit something that you haven't staged yet, but if you hit the commit button without staging anything, the Web IDE won't raise an error. The problem is that you're probably going to mistakenly believe that you created a new commit with your changes, and then you'll go on coding without realizing you haven't created a new version based on what you were doing before. The same is true for attempting to stage or commit something that you haven't saved. Earlier, we set Web IDE to automatically save at a predefined interval, but you should still save frequently. Sometimes you staged the file, but you didn't actually save the current change, so again, your commit didn't include what you thought it did. So, setting Web IDE to automatically save at predefined intervals is a useful setting, but you should also save manually on a frequent basis. Now, there's another possible state for files in a Git repository as well, ignored. You can identify any file or any file matching a given pattern to be ignored in Git. Ignored files are basically invisible. You can't stage them, and Git doesn't care what you do with them. Ignoring files and file types is useful in a variety of situations. For example, if you're developing in Java, when you compile, you would probably want Git to ignore all your compiled .class and .jar files. You wouldn't want those to be accidentally included in a new version of your code since they're in bytecode format. If you want to ignore a file or a file type, you create a file in your Git repository named .gitignore. You'll see a demo of this in a little bit. and you just fill it in with all the file names and file extensions that you want to ignore. Now there's another important topic related to commits called amending, but it's easier for me just to show you in the demo than it is to describe what amending is in the slides. Now, as I go through these demos, I've chosen to use simple HTML files. We're going to be building a simple web page. Now, if you're an experienced UI5 developer and you want to work on a full UI5 application to be used for the demos in this class, feel free. Or if you find HTML too confusing and you just prefer to use simple .txt files as you follow along with the demos, that's fine as well. I choose a simple index.html file with a few supporting files so that things are as simple as possible while still being able to run the page in WebIDE for testing. In particular, the web page we'll be building is a simple list of quotations. Feel free, of course, to use your own quotations to personalize your web page. Before I start, there's an important little technical detail you should be aware of. From here on out, when I do these demos, I'm not going to be copying and pasting information. Instead, I'm going to be typing in the contents of the files in WebIDE manually. The reason I'm going to do this is because WebIDE is intelligent enough to notice when you've copied and pasted something. And so when you copy and paste, it's going to tell Git that you've changed every single line that you copied and pasted, even if you copied and pasted the exact same content. And that will mess up a lot of demos because Git will detect changes where you didn't intend to have changes. And that's especially going to be true in week 2. So when you do the demos and you make changes to the files, do so manually. Don't just copy and paste the entire file from somewhere else. So let's move to the demo. Here we have WebIDE, which you have bookmarked. And before we do anything, we did this briefly before, but let's just make sure, that under Save Options, you have automatically save changes in all documents at preset intervals. Remember, this is something we want to be sure to set, but we don't want to rely on it. Okay, another thing we should do, just because it'll make things more explicit, let's go to View, and let's say Show Hidden Files. That way, if you see something in the staging area and you don't see it here, you won't be confused. Okay, so let's go to the main demo folder. Remember, I called my repository 0main_OpenSAP_repo. And let's go to the Git pane. We're in the Git history pane right now. Here's the Git pane. Note that a file right here, .che/project.json is here. And if we open this, because we showed hidden files, we can see it right here, this .project.json file. Let's say we want to ignore this file. We don't want to check it in. It was automatically generated by WebIDE, but let's just say we want to ignore it. So let's go here, and we'll say New File, and the file name is going to be .gitignore, .gitignore. Now, let's see what happens if we say in our gitignore star.json. So we're going to ignore all JSON files, is what we're telling it. Notice that this file, project.json, disappeared from our staging area. It is now being ignored. Let's do one other thing. I want to show you that you can, if you want to, you can ignore not just wildcarded files, but specific files. So let's create a file called temp.txt. And I'm not even going to put any contents in it, but of course you see temp.txt here. And let's say we don't want to ignore all .txt files, but we do want to ignore temp.txt, that exact file. So I saved the gitignore, and whoops, it disappeared from the staging area again. That's exactly what ignoring files do. So now .gitignore is actually a file, and it's part of the project. So let's go ahead and commit this. Now remember, we have to save. On my computer, that's Control S. If you're using a PC, that's the shortcut. And I'm going to stage it. Remember, you have to save, then stage. And I'm going to add a commit message, added initial.getIgnore file. I'm going to commit. Great. Now, let's look over in the history pane. You see that I added the .getignore file. And we have, I'm sorry, I'm going to go there again. That was kind of fast. Looking on branch master, we have one commit. And that commit is that we added the getignore file. One trick, and I will probably make this mistake in this course sometimes, is that the history pane in Git will only show the history of the file you have highlighted over here. So sometimes you'll be in a situation you'll say, hey, I know I created a commit, where is it? Well, if you have the wrong file highlighted, see here, this is an ignored file, so it doesn't show me any history. If you want to see the history of your entire repository, you need to select this while in the history pane. Okay, so we've made our initial commit. Now let's create our initial index.html file. This is going to be involving some typing, and that's okay. We can type. It's not going to be too much, and there won't be very much typing after we create the initial one. So I'm just taking out manually. You can follow along with what I'm doing, but I'll just do a very basic blank, pretty much blank HTML page. So doc type HTML and HTML language lang equals en end quote, and now I'll do the head section, and I'll do a meta HEP-EQUIV equals content-type in quotes, content equals text/HTML, char set equals UTF-8, and I'll end this tag here. And then I'll do title an empty web page. Then out of the head section, I'll go down here underneath the head section. I'll do a body, which is going to be, as I said, mostly blank. I'll do a H1 heading. This web page is blank. Well, it's not completely blank, so let's do an H2 setting here that's heading that says, well, mostly blank anyway. Okay, so we have our index.html. Now I want to do something else. I'm going to go to the getignore. I want to highlight that staging can affect the order of commits. So I'm going to go back to getignore. I'm going to remove temp.text. I'm going to hit save. And now it detects three things. It detects that getignore has changed. It detects that, and you can see there's a different symbol next to getignore to show change. And it detects that these two files have been added. Now, I made the change to index.html, the new file here, before I made this change to my getignore. But my commit will only include what I stage. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, even though I made the getignore change after the index.html change, I'm going to go and say removed. Now I'm only staging the getignore, temp.txt from getignore. So I've saved this. I've staged it. Now I'm going to commit it. Now, we have a new commit. If I go up here to the main, because I want to see the whole thing and see the history, we're going to see I have a new commit, new version here. Okay, now I want to show you something else. I'm going to delete temp.txt. And because I never added it to a version, it's not going to see this as a file removal. Now I'm going to say, I'm going to stage my index.html, added initial index.html, mostly empty. And I've staged it, and I'm going to commit it. Now here's what I wanted to show you here. Now we've created a new version. Go up here, go to the history pane, and we see that we have added this. What I wanted to point out here is that notice that this commit comes after this one in the version history, even though I did this change first manually. That's because I only staged this change before I did a commit. So staging is a way to isolate the changes that are in your working area that you actually want to record. So let's show you a couple of other things. I want to show you amending now. Now, I don't have a slide on this, but this is an important concept. It's going to come up a few times, and you definitely need to know it, and it'll be tested and things like that. So let's say that after making that commit to index.html, which I made here, this is the most recent commit, right? Yep. I made this index.html commit, and I realized I don't want this to be a period. I want it to be an exclamation point. So I hit save, and I stage it. But that's the only change I want to make. I changed a period into an exclamation point. That doesn't seem worth a whole commit. Well, Git and WebIDE give you this functionality here. See this little box that says amend? If I hit click, now look what happened to my commit message. It showed the same previous commit message that I already typed in. Why is that? Well, when you click amend before commit, what you're saying is don't create a new commit. Add the changes that I'm staging now to the previous commit. So it's what it sounds like. You're amending a previous commit. So let's go ahead and commit this. Now let's go to the Git history pane and notice that we did not create, come on, here we go. We did not create a new commit. We just added to the previous one. So now, as far as our version history is concerned, this exclamation point has always been there. Now, one other thing I want to show you is discarding. This is a simple but important functionality. I'm going to create a new text file called file2_discard. You can discard new files. You can discard changes. So I'm added it. You see this change is ready in my staging area to be, and let's delete readme.md. Yes, I'm sure I want to delete it. Notice, and I mentioned this before, deletions also show up in your staging area and need to be staged if they're going to be part of your new version. And let me just add something crazy to this. Something crazy is the title of this new web page. By the way, I meant to do this before, but let's just test our web page and make sure it works. Should have done that before. Notice the title, something crazy. And then after changing index.html, creating a new file, and deleting this file, I decide, I don't really want any of that. So if I right-click index.html, we've got it right here. Right-click it, and I say discard. Notice that our change went away. So if you haven't committed yet, then before you stage, you can always right-click any set of changes you made and just get rid of them. Now I'm going to click discard all, and this will discard both the creation of this file to discard and the deletion of readme.md. So I'm going to click discard all. Hit OK. And notice files to discard is now gone, and readme.md has reappeared. So now, at this point, you should understand the concept of the Git staging area. You should know how to decide which of your changes will go into the next commit. You should know how to commit. You should know how to ignore files using git ignore. And you should also know how to amend a commit if the change you wanted to make is minor and doesn't deserve a commit of its own. I now invite you to join me in the next unit, where we will have a brief discussion and a demo of stashing.